Hello, I'm Guy. I'm going to be giving a presentation that I was supposed to give at EC, but unfortunately I was sick, so this is the virtual substitute. I'm going to talk about my paper, Drivers of Digital Attention, Evidence from a Social Media Experiment. So, this project started with the observation that people are spending a lot of time online, right? So last year, the average American spent nearly 1,300 hours on social media. Nearly half of the world's population used Facebook, one of the most prominent social media applications. Now, because of this sort of concentration of time and attention on a select set few of platforms, it's kind of emerged a broad global debate about regulation of these platforms, right? So you open up your favorite newspaper periodical like The Economist, The New York Times, and you see constant articles thinking about antitrust questions here. This isn't just of interest in the press, but the FTC has an active antitrust complaint against Facebook. And so if you go, in some of the filings here, kind of the sort of question at the heart of this case is kind of which we view as substitutes for a product like Facebook, right? So a lot of the standard antitrust toolkit doesn't directly apply in these contexts because consumers pay no prices to use these services. And so thinking about sort of these questions of substitutes and demand is kind of first order in these antitrust considerations. The second element of demand for these applications is kind of characterized by pictures like this, right? Where people are spending a lot of time, but they're kind of glued to their phones and addicted in a psychological in kind of an anecdotal sense, right? With unclear implications for antitrust. And so this backdrop, the goal of this paper is broadly to kind of think about studying demand for these applications and how we can do so. And try to answer two questions here. The first is, how do we think about this question of relevant substitutes in relevant markets, which is first order for the antitrust question? And second, can we quantify the role that kind of more broadly inertia plays, right? The sort of the amount of usage that's picked up through this sort of automatic usage, and how important is this for thinking about substitution patterns? And so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to run an experiment where I collect comprehensive data on how people spend their time. So I'm going to have continuous automated monitoring of what people do on their phones and what they do on their computers. Okay, so I'm going to see minute by minute what's going on. Then I'm going to use the fact that I use parental control software to monitor the phone to randomize restrictions on mobile phone applications. So for some people, I'm going to take away their Instagrams. For others, I'm going to take away their YouTubes. And there's going to be some variation in the length of these restrictions. Third, what I'm going to do is I'm going to characterize substitution patterns of time allocations. Or I'm going to ask the question of kind of like, given this variation of people don't have Instagram or they don't have YouTube, we're going to ask which activities do people substitute during the restriction period, and to provide an interpretation of kind of how we should think about this in terms of relevant substitutes. Second, we're going to ask, given that there's variation in the length of restrictions, we observe people after the restriction's over, and the restrictions are relatively long, we can ask whether there are persistent effects of these restrictions. Okay. Then we're going to put this all together using I'm going to estimate a time usage model with consumer inertia. And first, I'm just going to quantify how much of the overall usage of these applications comes from this inertia channel. And then second, I'm going to apply diversion ratios both with and without inertia to thinking about this relevant market question to try to understand kind of how critical is this inertia channel when we're thinking about these antitrust questions. Okay. So first, overview the experiment. So what we do here is we're going to use a university lab field predominantly, right? So we're going to recruit nearly 389 participants from Chicago Booth, NYU, Columbia, HKUST, and only 4 participants from Facebook ads. They're going to be relatively young, right? So kind of because they're coming from lab pools, there's going to be some demographic selection. And this was kind of a very conscious choice here, right? Because other recruitment methods might give you a more demographically representative sample, but potentially less representative in terms of intensity of usage. And so here we have demographic selection, but we're not as selected in terms of kind of who opts into the study based on their social media usage. Okay. The compensation is going to be $50 for completing the study, plus kind of a survey incentive based on an additional restriction. Now, participants are going to install Android parental control software and a Chrome extension that's going to allow me to do the restrictions and to monitor what they do, right? So this software is going to allow me to see minute by minute what's going on, which applications on the phone are installed, kind of which are the new applications, what are the sessions, and overall time applications, okay? Then we're going to restrict either YouTube or Instagram, and we're going to do block randomization according to baseline usage, right? So one crucial study detail is that participants are not told which application is going to be restricted until like 1 hour before the restriction period, right? And so we're going to have block randomization according to this baseline usage, where people are going to use their phones for a week. At the end of that week, they're told which applications are restricted and what restrictions they're going to have, right? So we start with self-service installation with kind of Zoom meetings to confirm. Then we have this baseline period of 1 week with no restriction. People are sent a text about what application they're restricted. We use the baseline period to make sure that we're balanced in terms of overall usage across these things, across these treatments. The restrictions, either 1 or 2 weeks of no YouTube, Instagram, or in the control group, and there's 2 to 3 weeks of post-restriction period, okay? So that's the experiment overview. Now, what about the results that we have from the study, okay? So the first question we want to ask is, how do people substitute during the restriction period, right? And so the sort of core question at the heart of a lot of the antitrust debate is kind of which type of applications are substitutes, right? So there's a large back and forth about, we should only think about kind of social media applications as being the substitutes for these applications, whereas sort of some people kind of contend that we should think more broadly in terms of, any application that kind of competes for users' time and attention is a substitute for the social media application. And so to sort of operationalize that in this context, what we're going to do is, remember, we observe every application that people use on the phone. Now, all of these applications have a category assigned to them in the Google Play Store. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at substitution across these different categories, okay? And so the first thing we want to ask is, how does it impact own category time, right? So we restricted social media application Instagram and entertainment application YouTube. And we want to ask, do people substitute to applications in the own category? And so the first thing we find is that in both treatments, there's a substantial reduction in own category time, right? So if we compare the basket of social applications in the treatment versus the basket of social applications in the control, we're going to find a reduction. Now, one important detail here is that in the control group for the Instagram treatment, this is including Instagram. For the YouTube group, this is including YouTube, right? So a more interesting comparison is to ask kind of, is there any change in non-Instagram social or non-YouTube entertainment? And for YouTube, we find very little substitution towards other applications in the own category. For Instagram, we find that there's a 22.7% increase in the usage of other social applications, right? So, while people aren't perfectly substituting towards other social applications, there is some substitution of social applications for Instagram, okay? Now, perhaps the more interesting question then within categories, again, this question of, are people substituting across product categories? And what we find is some asymmetries in substitution patterns, right? So people substitute from YouTube towards the social applications. We see, 15.1% increase in time spent on social applications. We find weaker evidence for cross-category substitution here, right? So we see a marginally significant substitution towards communication applications of 10.4%, right? But both of these seem to indicate some heterogeneity in terms of, category substitution patterns here. Now, one thing that we can do to kind of shed some light on this is that, this is potentially consistent with heterogeneous uses of these applications, right? So one question we ask in the baseline survey is, for these focal applications, kind of what's the main reason that they're using them? Is it for entertainment purposes, right? So watching funny videos, looking at memes. Is it for social purposes in a passive sense, right? Keeping up with your friends, seeing the posts that they post. Is it for direct communication, right? Directly talking to your friends. Is it for, broadly speaking, getting information? Or getting information is not just, reading news, but also potentially, more niche informational streams like economics or computer science papers or online shopping. Again, if you look at this, kind of the entertainment applications like YouTube and YouTube and Netflix are predominantly used for entertainment purposes. Communication applications like WhatsApp and Messenger are used for, for communication purposes predominantly. But if you look at the social media applications, there's a wide heterogeneity, right? Twitter is mainly used for information. Snapchat's used for communication. Reddit's used for information. TikTok for entertainment. Instagram and Facebook are used sort of across a wide range of these, right? They're used both for entertainment and for social purposes, right? And so despite the fact that these are predominantly kind of social media applications, they seem to have kind of distinctive uses, right? And so it's not too surprising that when we take away YouTube, we actually see that people are substituting to an Instagram and to a TikTok, right? Because these applications serve the same functional purpose as them, right? And so again, for Instagram and Facebook, some of them are used for communication as well, right? And so, when we're thinking about this question of cross-category substitution, it's not just necessarily about kind of the category that they're in, but also potentially kind of like how people are actually using them. In terms of, does this matter? So one way to approach the relevant market is to say, let's just consider, all the different application, the categories that people substitute to. And so, the first question is, would this matter? And so you can look at HHIs and you can find that, there would be qualitative differences in assessments of market concentration. Finally, there is substitution, reduction overall phone usage in both treatments, right? So people are substituting to non-digital activities. I use the Chrome extension in surveys to show that there's minimal cross-device substitution, okay? In terms of experimental results, for post-restriction, there are signs of inertia that drive the usage of these applications, right? So for Instagram, I find persistent reductions in usage for the 2-week group. For YouTube, they spend more time on newly installed applications. I interpret these reduced form results as sort of signs of inertia. And now what we want to do is kind of turn to the demand model and try to quantify this a little bit and see how important it is, okay? So utility specifications as follows, right? A consumer I and application J and sort of market K, where market K is, again, remember, we observe this set of installed applications. And so this is the set of installed applications at any given point in time, period T, where time here is discretized into 5-minute intervals. The first thing is this, long-term stock of usage in the past 2 weeks enters directly into consumer utility. This is sort of the longer-term inertia. In terms of shorter-term inertia, there's consecutive time periods using the application, and then a quadratic term, right, which accounts for potential satiation effects in short-term usage. We control for kind of product fixed effects, not just having kind of a standard product fixed effect, but also kind of accounting for the subject-specific activity that they use the application for. And then we also have the number of self-reported connections, okay? And then you have your standard type 1 extreme value error. You notice these QIs, the sort of estimation procedure here is kind of the heterogeneity I'm most worried about is kind of more extreme users of these applications. And so the estimation procedure is first to use the baseline period to cluster people using k-means, and then estimate the logit model type by type using MLE. The final model component is there's an outside option that kind of varies across the week, right? So to explain the variation in the data of usage across time, it's not in the utility they get from the application per se, but from the outside option varying across time. Okay. Now, the main counterfactual that we care about here is kind of what happens if this long-term inertia channel shut down, right? So in particular, if we set beta QI to be 0 for all I. And so there's kind of two interpretations of this counterfactual that I care about. The first is that these actually give more direct measures of substitution patterns, right? Because in essence, in the baseline period, people are more likely to substitute to applications that are sort of more habituated to using. But here, kind of by parsing out this habit aspect, you can actually get a cleaner picture for kind of which applications are really substitutes, kind of if you took away this habitual aspect. The second is that there's an interesting debate in this market, which is effectively, you can kind of view this as being a limit case of the role of policies aimed at curbing digital addiction, right? So, there's some natural components of sort of inertial usage in these markets, but there's a whole separate debate from a more welfare perspective that sort of these platforms are engineered to get people addicted. And so there's been some policy proposals on this front, right? And so here we kind of want to take the stance of, you can view this counterfactual as kind of a limit case of kind of, how would these digital addiction policies influence substitution patterns of these applications? And so should we think about this from an antitrust perspective? So what are the results from this counterfactual? So the first thing we find is that the overall usage of considers applications, drops nearly 30%, right? So by shutting down inertia, the sort of basket of social media applications reduces usage by 30%. In terms of which applications are most impacted, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are kind of the largest of these. Now, we find that diversion towards larger applications drops, but that some applications actually have increased diversion, right? So this, again, goes to show that, this habitual aspect isn't just going to uniformly reduce usage, but potentially sort of increase diversion towards smaller applications in the sample. Okay. Now, we want to apply this to kind of thinking about relevant market definition. And so we're going to use a really simple, a procedure for determining this. So again, from the model, we get diversion ratios, right? Which are effectively what share of usage goes to an application after application I is taken out of the market, right? So what happens if you take out Instagram in terms of, the model-based estimates of how this would impact substitution patterns, okay? So we sort, for each application, the diversion ratios in descending order, and we add applications until we reach some threshold tau. And so the main takeaways we have here is first that the relevant market's broadly defined, right? Comparing, the results that we get here to, for instance, FDC's definition of Snapchat, we find a relatively broad market in terms of substitution across a number of these social media applications and not just Snapchat. The second takeaway is that inertia quantitatively is large enough to kind of expand this definition, right? We get a larger set of substitutes when we consider this, and kind of it highlights that regulatory policies targeting inertia can actually be pro-competitive. Okay. So to conclude, what it is that we talked about today, right? So I conducted a field experiment collecting data on how people spend their time. I shut off access to popular mobile phone applications. The main experimental results were that there was these dispersed substitution patterns. We see some cross-category substitution. We see some off-phone substitution. We found reduced form evidence of patterns of consumer inertia. We quantified this using a model to show that it counts for nearly 30% of usage of these applications. In terms of broader takeaways, there's three, I think, here. The first is that we can use these kind of product unavailability experiments paired with sort of rich data collection to kind of answer some of the antitrust questions in these markets, right? So there's some challenges in these markets in terms of antitrust, but we also have a much richer data collection toolkit relative to other typical markets. And so I think this study highlights what are the benefits of these different approaches. From policy takeaways, kind of I find broader relevant market definition than those posited by regulatory authorities, indicating kind of how people use these applications is kind of crucial for substitution patterns. And finally, kind of digital addiction policies may be a useful antitrust tool, not just in terms of thinking about their effects on welfare, but they may also make the market a bit more pro-competitive. Okay, thank you very much, and feel free to email with any questions. Thank you.